I suppose I'm on? Okay. Let's get this show on the road. I understand there's an important game this afternoon. Yeah, the Twins are playing, but so back when I first started being a ranger, I was told by several individual rangers that I should get myself a leather citation book. Some of you might be familiar with one of these, right? And I was taught in the academy that they teach something different now on approaches to vehicle stops. But I was told in the academy when you approach a vehicle you've just pulled over to take your citation book with you as you walk up to the vehicle. And there's a few reasons for that. One is if they try and, pull a gun on you or something from the driver's seat, you can whack them before you can get your own gun out. There's good reasons for it. But if you get out and walk up to the vehicle empty-handed, then they think, okay, maybe it was an equipment violation. Maybe I got a taillight out or something. And they take a little bit less seriously. But if you get this book out and walk up with the book, everybody knows who's a driver what the book means. Whether you're going to write them a ticket or not, it doesn't matter. It adds to the command presence. And I found real early in my career that there is some truth in that command presence of the book. I found myself on the 4th of July one year, very early in my career, with a parking problem. There was a couple of dozen vehicles parked on a lawn in one of my parks. And now it's the 4th of July, and I really didn't want to go crashing somebody's party by writing a bunch of parking tickets. And by the time I got through with the third one, somebody was going to come up and start arguing with me about, well, everybody else was parked here, and where should I park? And so I thought, how can I deal with this without writing anybody a ticket and spoiling their parade? And so I just got the book out. And I opened the book up, and I walked over to the first car, and I just stood there. And as soon as I started walking from car to car, and pretty soon, people all left. Nobody argued with me. A few people came up and said, I'm really sorry, somebody else was parked here. I thought it was okay, which is kind of what I expected. We're going to see a little bit of a situation today where someone, the Jews, rain on somebody's parade and spoil his enthusiasm. We're going to be in John chapter 5. And we're going to start at the pool of Bethesda. Now, the word Bethesda comes from Bethzeda in the Hebrew. It means house of mercy or house of grace. The pool itself had 5 colonnades or porches, porticos around it. And for many centuries, the people who detracted from the book of John and tried to argue that it was written later by somebody other than John, and it was written by somebody who didn't know anything about Jerusalem, because there is no 5-sided pool in Jerusalem. Well, in the 19th century, archaeologists found a 4-sided pool that was easily identifiable as the pool of Bethesda, with a portico on each side and one right down the middle. So there were 5 porches or porticos around it. The pool itself is only 2 or 3 feet deep with water, but there was about a 20 or more foot drop to get from the side into where the pool was. So there was a stairway that went down into the water. This was a place where it was reported that an angel of the Lord would come from time to time and stir the waters with his hands or his wings or something, and the first person to get in the pool would be healed. There's no way we can know if that's true, and in fact, John doesn't really address it well. The Romans, after they destroyed the temple and laid siege to Jerusalem for so many years in 70 AD, they ended up building a health spa at this pool of Bethesda because they too believed it had some kind of curative properties. So there may be something to that. So as we open this story here, we're at the pool of Bethesda, and it's full of, or the surrounding area is full of, probably a couple of thousand people who are infirm, lame, maybe some of them are just lazy, but they're there because they want to be healed. And there might be one lucky person who wins that lottery. Normally there was about 300 people that would show up at that pool every day, historians of the time recorded, but during the feast seasons, sometimes there would be 2,000 or 3,000 people. So that sets up where we are in John chapter 5. Starting at verse 1, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of individuals, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" And the sick man said, "What, are you crazy, man? I've been laying here for 38 years. Of course I want to be healed." No, he doesn't say that. He looks up and sees compassion and sincerity in Jesus' eyes. And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool where the water is stirred up, when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." We'll pause right there. So this fellow has been here for the better part of 40 years. We don't know what his infirmity was, but John uses a Greek word that doesn't mean crippled or in any other way mangled. He uses a word for infirm. So the man obviously was frail enough that he could be at the pool, but he wasn't strong enough to get himself into the pool. And so he was infirm in some manner. Maybe his muscles weren't all that strong and had atrophied, but he had that condition for 38 years. It wasn't something new for him. He may have been a beggar. He says, "There was no one here to help me." So he's alone. He doesn't even have a friend to help him get into the pool all of this time. So he was clearly abandoned. And here comes this stranger. He looked on Jesus, and he would have seen by his dress that he was Galilean. And the Galileans are known to be put up with the ridicule of the Judeans. And this man himself is infirm and probably put up with a fair amount of ridicule from the Judeans himself. And so he gave Jesus a sincere answer from his heart. It says that John says that Jesus came to know, or when Jesus saw that the man had been there for years. We can look back at 2:24 where where John records, Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people. He knows what's in the heart of every individual. And so Jesus came to know that this man had been there a long time. And that was enough. So now there's this man sprawled out on a mat near the edge of the pool of Bethesda. He's alone. He seems to be friendless and abandoned by humanity. And this stranger comes up and asks the $40,000 question. Do you want to be healed? Why did Jesus ask that question? He knows the man's heart and what's in the man's mind. Right? The man's been sitting there for the better part of 40 years. He's probably fairly discouraged. It's become a habit for him to be there, but does he really think he's ever going to be the first one in? Maybe if circumstances change, he can drag himself in. Jesus probably wants this man to express his desire to be healed, to articulate it with his mouth, to refresh himself to that reality of why he's there. So he looks into Jesus' face, and he sees the face that we'll all get to look on someday with sincerity and compassion. And he doesn't say, "Are you mocking me?" He says, "I have no man, or I have no one to help me." Right? He's relying on people rather than on God. He says, when the water is stirred, so he's relying on the circumstances rather than on God. He says, there's no one to put me in the pool. So he's limiting God's work to this particular geographic area. And he says, someone always gets there first. So he's blaming others for his past failures of being able to get there, rather than seeing that there's present divine possibilities right in front of him. The man is living in the physical world. That's where he is steeped. Just like Nicodemus was, the woman at the well. We've seen over and over again people who are just stuck in their minds living in this world and not seeing beyond to the things of God. So Jesus calls this man to do the impossible. Verse 8, Jesus said, "Get up, take your bed and walk." Gero. It's a popular exclamation that a parent would have used to tell their lazy child to get up. Right? Gero. Right? It's present, active, imperative tense. So it's a command. Jesus calls this man to get up without any thought that the man wouldn't. It's expected in the very command that the man is going to get up and walk. Verse 9. And at once the man was healed. And he took up his bed and walked. So imagine how this man would have felt. We're not told. We're not told that he thanked Jesus. We're not told that he was excited. Sometimes when Jesus or one of the apostles later would heal someone, they would leap for joy. They would lean on Peter and John and thank them for what they have done for him and that sort of thing. And we get no indication here other than he was infirm and now he is made whole. After 38 years, probably of very little or no muscle tone, laying there friendless, he's now been healed. Has to be an amazing feeling for this man. Hopelessness he still went there, maybe something would change and he could be the one. Well, continuing on, it says, now that day was the Sabbath. Oh, no. Oh, no. Okay. The fact that it was the Sabbath was not on this guy's radar. Right? This stranger says, get up, take your bed, and walk. And the man responded to the sincerity, apparently, in Jesus' voice, and he did what Jesus said. And he rolled up his mat, and he walked for the first time probably in almost 40 years. And then Jesus just disappears into the crowd, which, since it was a feast, and we're not told which feast it was a feast, and there would have been thousands and thousands of pilgrims there to celebrate the feast. Remember, John is presenting a case for Christ. He's not giving us a chronology of events. During the Passover, earlier that year, maybe the year before, depends on what feast this is, Jesus went all around Jerusalem healing, doing signs and wonders, and people were amazed. But John doesn't give us any details of those. John calls out this healing in Jerusalem very specific. This is the third sign that we're given by John that give us details. We have to keep in mind that these are not isolated events. Talked a little bit about that last time. That they may appear that way to those who are witnessing them, because probably not everyone who's seeing this man walk after 38 years saw any of the others. There's such huge crowds. So they're looking at it as one amazing sign. But the Pharisees, who are tracking all this stuff on their radar, are seeing individual isolated incidents being performed by one particular individual that cannot escape them. So Jesus now heads out of the pool of Bethesda and walks up to the Temple Mount where the temple is, which wasn't a very far walk. In verse 10, so the Jews, that would be the religious leaders, the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. The book. They got the book out, and they ignored the fact that this man was healed. And they really rained on his parade. But he answered them, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. And they asked him, who is this man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? They didn't ask him, who is this man who healed you? Right? What were they concerned about? The law. Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn as there was a crowd in the place. So the religious leaders throw water on this guy's newfound life, right? Get off the grass. Can't you read the sign? It's the Sabbath. Everybody knows that you're not supposed to carry a burden on the Sabbath, and you're walking around carrying your bed. Why did the Pharisees say this? I'm going to run through a couple of Old Testament passages. After Nehemiah led the rebuilding of Jerusalem, at the end of the chapter 13 at the end of the book, in verse 19. I'm going to read from the Complete Jewish Bible. So when the gates of Jerusalem began to grow dark before Shabbat, that would be the Sabbath, I ordered that the doors be shut, and I ordered that they would not be opened until after Shabbat. I put some of my servants in charge of the gates to see to it that no loads were brought in on Shabbat. It was important to the Jews to not bring loads into Jerusalem and walk about on Shabbat, Sabbath. In Jeremiah 17, in verse 21, the prophet says, again in the Complete Jewish Bible, here is what Adonai says. If you value your lives, don't carry anything on Shabbat or bring it in through the gates of Jerusalem. In Numbers 15, you might recall, the Israelites found a man among their relatives and friends who was gathering firewood on Shabbat. And they took him before Moses and said, what do we do with him? It's a violation to do work on the Sabbath. And Moses and Aaron went to God and asked God, and God said that everyone every one of the Israelites should together stone him. Carrying a burden, lifting things and doing work on the Sabbath was very serious to God. And so it was a capital offense. Now, during Jesus' time, they actually didn't do that very often for any reason. The Jews didn't have the political authority any longer in Israel to execute people. That's why they took Jesus to Pilate, so that they could get permission from the Roman government to execute him. When they stoned Stephen, they were so overwhelmed by what he had said that they rushed him out of the town, the proper 10-mile distance, which was the distance between how fast a horse could run and a rider could run and get to the person and bring him back if somebody, a witness, came forward and all that. They didn't care about Rome anymore at that point. But here, this man brings a burden into the city gates on Shabbat, which was punishable by death. So this was a huge violation for the Jews. And they ignored the fact that he had been healed. So now this man is fully healed and standing erect before them. He's probably pretty darn happy. Right? The religious leaders, though, are throwing water on his parade. They're not amazed that he's no longer infirm, maybe twisted and laying on his mat. Right? They didn't fall down and worship God Almighty for what has happened to this man and praise him. Right? So the man says, I don't know, some stranger came up and said, Zot do, get up and walk, carry your mat. And so I did. And look. Right? Now, remember that Jesus had been going around Jerusalem healing people, performing signs and wonders. So it's on their radar, the radar of the religious leaders. And so I can imagine them in their little dark corners in the temple starting to ask, I wonder if it's this Jesus of Nazareth guy. He's really becoming a problem. Verse 14. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. The man went to the temple, maybe to present himself to the priests as now ceremonially clean so that he could worship at the temple once again. The pool of Bethesda, even though it was a pool that you could wash in and become ceremonially clean, it was surrounded constantly by unclean individuals, not lepers per se, but people who were defiled in their person. And so the Pharisees and the religious leaders would not want to venture down there and go there very often. And so when a person was healed of some infirmity, which never happened, there was a direction in the Torah, the Old Testament law, to go to the temple and present yourself to the priest. And that's probably what this man is doing. Now think about this for a minute. He's wading his way through this packed crowd of humanity who have come for this feast. And he feels a hand on the back of his shoulder, a firm hand, and he turns around, and it's the man that healed me. Jesus warns him not to use his newfound life and health to go out and sin. Now, don't assume that he was lame because he sinned. The disciples ask that question later on about somebody else, and we'll talk about that later. But Jesus is just giving him a direction now. And we don't know that the man is saved at this point. The first part of John was dealing with salvation issues, with Nicodemus, the woman at the well. This part, we haven't seen any kind of change in heart, only in his physical body. Verse 15. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. This was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. So this guy goes and paddles on Jesus, rats him out to the cops. Jesus didn't tell him, like he did others, don't tell anyone about this. Of course, they always did. But why would the man go to the priests and talk to them about it? Their opinion of him is that he is a Sabbath breaker because he listened to some stranger and picked up his bed and walked into the city of Jerusalem on the Sabbath in complete mockery of the Sabbath laws. And so he's probably trying to clear his name. You want the name of the guy? I'll give you the name of the guy. I found it, so you can go talk to him about what he did instead of harassing me about it. He wants to have a good name before these guys. And it says that this is why they persecuted Jesus. John uses the Greek word dioko. And it means to make, to run, or flee. To put to flight. To drive away. The lexicon said it means in any way to harass, trouble, or molest. And it's in the perfect form. The imperfect form, which means that they began to persecute him and they continued it. It was a process that they were going through. It wasn't just an action that was isolated. Okay? They put the pressure on at this point so that he would go away, stop doing these things that they were being uncomfortable about him doing. Right? And then maybe he would never come back. Pressure began to be put on, not because he was claiming to be God, but because he said, told this man to do something on the Sabbath that they saw as contrary to God's law. So this is a good place for us to jump off the story. But I wanted to address 3 points. The first is, the man was living in the physical world. He wanted a miracle, but he relied on others before God. It's a good thing to rely on one another. He puts us in a family of believers so that we can minister the gifts that he's given us one to another. But it's always in a reliance on God's grace overshadowing that. And this man was always looking for others to help him. He relied on the circumstances to improve. Maybe if things just get a little bit better, maybe I'll get a little stronger if I go to physical therapy, and I'll be able to get myself down into the pool by myself. Right? He's looking at circumstances to improve rather than relying on God's grace. He's expecting God to only work in a very limited area. As we saw, Jesus healed the man, and the man wasn't even in the pool. The waters weren't even stirring. But he was looking totally focused on that one place. That's where God was going to maybe heal him. And he blamed others for his situation. It's always somebody else who gets there first. So we can expect God to work in us and through us and bless us in his own way, in his own time, and for his own glory. And we're called to be his ambassadors, no matter what our circumstance is. To let him do the work through us and in us as we yield to his Spirit in us. The second point is that Jesus called this man to express his desire for a miracle and to refresh his mind to why he was there. We're called to constantly evaluate our faith. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12, Paul wrote, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." Now, working out our salvation is not working for our salvation. Think about this for a minute. When you were in school, right, your teacher gave you math problems to work out. How you worked out those math problems wasn't ever going to change the answer. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. If Nate has 2 cows and his dad has 2 cows, together they will always have 4 cows. So working out our salvation is not working for our salvation. When we worked out the math problem, right, it was for us to learn to see how it works and to see how it plays out in our life with cows or pizzas or money or whatever. Right? So working out our faith with fear and trembling, working out our salvation with fear and trembling, demonstrates to our own satisfaction. It teaches us so that we get it, so we can see how our faith plays out in life. It refreshes to our recollection where we have been and why we are here now in Christ Jesus. And the third thing is that Jesus cautioned the man not to use his new life as license to sin. Paul gives some perspective for a New Testament saint on this. In 1 Corinthians 10, he saes, All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful, or edifying, or build up. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. This is a restatement of something he said a couple chapters earlier in 1 Corinthians 6. Even more, between them in 1 Corinthians 8:9, he says, "But take care that this right of yours in liberty does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak." It is possible to use our liberty in Christ Jesus to sin and to draw others into sin and sometimes to wreck the faith of a brother or a sister. Instead, Paul says in Ephesians, first verse of chapter 4, "Therefore, as a prisoner for the Lord, I urge you, walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called." Jesus could very well have told this man he just healed the same thing. He told him, go out and don't sin, because something else might happen to you. Okay? That's in a physical sense, I think. We're called to walk in a manner worthy of this tremendous calling that we have. And in Romans 14:16, Paul says, "So do not let, through your bad behavior, what you regard as good be spoken of as evil." God has performed an amazing miracle in the life of every individual who has put faith in Christ Jesus. And we were once dead, and now we are alive in Christ. We have been moved from the column of death into the column of life. We've been resuscitated, and our heart that once wasn't beating is now full of Jesus and is alive. So let's strive to live a life that's worthy of that miracle. A life that's worthy of the high calling he's given us as ambassadors.